Hey guys, Publik here to talk about everything you know to play Shadow Priest for the launch of Dragonflight. This video is meant to kind of give you surface level information to get through preseason of Dragonflight Season 1. After a few weeks, I'll release kind of more in-depth videos. Once balancing is settled in, things feel a bit more stable, that kind of thing. For now, this video is kind of meant to be like, what do you need to get through launch? Talent builds, that kind of thing. So, as always, if you want the most updated information, just check out the Icy Veins guide, link in the description. Anyone viewing that really helps me out, so I appreciate it, guys. But with that started, let's get started. Let's see what we got. All right, so the first thing to cover is talents. So this is the newest thing coming with Dragonflight, the thing you're probably going to interact with the most this expansion. So we'll be talking about the most in this video is going to be the talent tree and kind of how you make some of these decisions. So I spent a lot of time on the Icy Veins guide, kind of going over what every single talent is actually doing and kind of when to pick which. There's also a pathing guide in there to check out if you're kind of curious, like some of the methods on like how you can craft builds of your own. I will say there's not a whole lot of things to kind of switch up or change depending on what you're doing. A lot of it's somewhat kind of set in stone what you want to pick. But I'll kind of go over 4 example builds in this video. So first one, it's just going to show you what single target looks like. Obviously for leveling, things are going to look a little different, but I wanted to cover this first. If you're just curious about if you even want to play Shadow Priest for launch, this is kind of what we're going to expect from a single target perspective. It does involve you picking up Mind Spike. Dark Ascension's the kind of current cooldown we're going to use on single target. And then for our idols, you know, you'll hear me talk a lot about these. The idols are the 4 talents on the very bottom of the tree. Idol of Yasharj, Cthulhu, Yogg-Saron, and N'Zoth. For the most part, you will see me never talk about N'Zoth. It's effectively tuned to be terrible. You won't be using it hardly at all. But for this build, so single target, like I said, Dark Ascension, you will be playing with Mind Spike a little bit here, and then you're using Yasharj and Cthulhu as your main idols. So this is kind of the basic, somewhat cookie cutter build for single target damage. Obviously, if things are, you know, there's an ad fight, multiple boss targets, we'll definitely want to change that up. Mythic Plus, change that up as well. But if you were talking about a pure single target patchwork boss, or you just want to be doing single target damage, this is kind of what it's going to feel like. So other things to highlight, the class tree. I'm not going to talk as much about this in this video. I've talked about it plenty before, but basically this guy has a lot of options for the kind of utility that you want to have on your priest. So feel free to kind of take this and run with it. And like I said, you know, this has kind of open to interpretation a little bit. Do you want more CC? Do you want more off healing? That kind of thing. These are just kind of what I prefer. Some of this stuff is somewhat non-negotiable, so to speak, if you're trying to min-max your damage. Like, you'll pick up the damaging buttons like Power Infusion in Mind Games, Halo, that kind of thing. But as far as the rest of it, it's kind of up to you and kind of what you want to do. So that is the class tree. And if I didn't already mention, all of these builds will be in the description of the video. You can check them out there below and then import them into your build on once live servers launch. Okay, so other things to talk about with single target, just things to note. We're also going to be playing with Mind Flay and Sanity with this guy. I did already mention Mind Spike. Now, I'll talk a little about the rotation in a little bit, but this is kind of what we're thinking single target wise. Now, if we switch this over to a leveling build, some things I'd recommend tweaking. I would drop Mind Spike for leveling. I think it's just too much of a pain in the butt to manage. If you don't want to play with it, don't play with it. Rather pick up Mind Seer. Grab something like Psychic Horror in the spec tree to give you a stun while leveling. This also kind of depends if you want to level in a group or not. So like I picked up things like Void Tendrils or other things that imply that I will be getting hit if I'm solo leveling, things like that, like Crystalline Reflection. Obviously, if you're leveling in the group, and especially with a tank, not something you care about as much. And a lot of this is very similar to the single target build, but there's some extra stuff thrown in there. Mainly, you can play with Mind Seer, but the beauty of Idol of Yasharj and Cthulhu, since it's also our best 2 single target idols, both those idols are also kind of cleave idols as well. So you kind of get the benefit of both worlds with this build. A little bit of Mind Devourer procs as well, and again, while leveling, just get rid of Mind Spike if you don't want to play with it. So this is the leveling build. Not too much else to say about that. And then moving on, if you want to do, or while you're leveling, you guys end up doing some dungeons, I have 2 builds for you to consider to just try out here. The first one is using Yasharj and Yogg-Saron with Void Form, and the second build, also using Void Form, is using Cthulhu and Yogg-Saron. So the key here is you definitely want to play Yogg-Saron inside of dungeons. Don't go inside of a dungeon without taking Yogg. And that is primarily because this talent right here, Mind Devour, is just so strong in dungeons. It gives you a full Mind Seer cast that's free. So you get basically 100 insanity for free when used on a Mind Seer. A lot of really good damage. After you've already invested 2 points into Mind Devour, you might as well finish it out and get Yogg. Which is why I say always take Yogg for Mythic Plus. So between these two builds, I would just kind of try them out, see which one you like. I think you could argue for one over the other depending on the kind of dungeon it is. Yashar's Yogg, I would categorize it as a bit more single target, right? You pick up Mind Flay Insanity here. You do still have some good cleave. You're going to pick up Psychic Link, Shadow Crash, all the usual stuff. But in general, it feels a bit more single targety. And I've actually seen some builds use this exact same setup, but instead of using Void Form, you go Dark Ascension instead for, again, just a little bit more single target. Something like 5% more single target if you really want. Thinking something like a Court of Stars type dungeon. Obviously, that's not in this first kind of pre-Season 1 dungeon pool, but it will be in the Season 1 dungeon pool. This build, however, we don't get Mind Flay Insanity. Instead, we're relying on Idol of Cthulhu and Yogg Saron. But because of that, you're kind of getting almost 3 idols worth of power here, because we almost have enough for Yasharj. Unfortunately, we're 1 point short, but you still get Inescapable Torment. So you effectively have 3 cleavy talents here in this kind of bottom section, with Inescapable Torment, Idol of Cthulhu, and Yogg Saron all kind of being these cleave talents. So definitely this build is leaning you more towards into AoE than single target. And this very highly dependent on kind of how they finalize some of the tuning. Cthulhu in particular is a little screwy. But yeah, these are the 2 kind of Mythic Plus builds that I would suggest going into. So this is a talent build. So again, like I said, these are your starting point. I'm not saying you should always use only these builds all the time. Feel free to tweak a little bit. And if you're really interested in kind of why I picked what I did and the min-maxi parts of it, the talent page in my guide goes really in depth into, okay, well, here's why you're picking stuff in this top section, in this second section, etc. And then after tuning, I'll plan on making kind of a video version of that. But this is the quick and easy version just to get you started, get you leveling, get you into your dungeons, that kind of thing. All right, let's move on to the rotation. Okay, so let's talk about the rotation quickly. So before I get started, just to note, as you import these talents as you level, you'll notice it kind of seems weird. So I just imported the leveling build that's in the description. You notice that it doesn't have any idle talents right now. The way that the talent imports work, they don't really have any concept of like, oh, you take this and then this. So you can see it's a little bit disparate here. Obviously, if you're actually looking at this, you would want to get an idol at some point first, so maybe moving some points around to get that. So just a note there. Obviously you can fill it out however you want, but things will be a little off without that. So yeah, so let's talk about the rotation. So I don't want to go into like super depth. There's a lot of conditions to the rotation if you really want to min-max and optimize it to the highest degree. So I'm going to do my best to try to simplify it for you just as like a getting started point for while you're leveling. So if you're just leveling, you're pulling up to a pack, the first thing you want to do is you want to put your dots up. Now, in my suggestions, I think you'll be taking Shadow Crash and Misery almost all the time, I think. And this leaves you with a lot of options. So if you have Shadow Crash available, go ahead and fire that out as you open a pack. It'll put your both dots up with Misery active. And that's going to be your kind of preferred opener. Now, if you don't have Shadow Crash up, meaning that it's on cooldown, you can just start the pack with Misery. Or sorry, with Vampiric Touch to apply both your dots. Now, the reason we want to do that is because Shadow Priest Mastery, you get more damage for your spells for each dot that you have on the target. And your dots in this case are just Shadow of Pain, Vampiric Touch, Devouring Plague. So opening with that means whatever spells you're pressing afterwards will deal significantly more damage. For me and my character, right now it's 13% per dot. It's a pretty big deal. So you'll start off with that. And right away, if you have your cooldowns up, I suggest using them as often as possible. Mindbender, Power Infusion right into Dark Ascension. And basically from there, you're just kind of using your builders and generators. And to eventually get to your spenders. So here, with the current suggestion, I do suggest you go down Inescapable Torment route to Idol Yasharj eventually. Obviously, right at 60, you're not going to have enough points to get both. But with that rotation, while you have Mindbender active, you're going to want to use Shadow Word Death as part of that rotation. Otherwise, put your dots up. When you get enough Insanity, spend it on Devouring Plague. Use Mind Blast on cooldown. Right? That's the basics. Now, If you have nothing else to press, Mind Blast is on cooldown. You can throw things like Shadow Crash if it's off cooldown if you want. That's where you can use spells like Mind Games or Halo from the class tree, or any of the others kind of like short cooldown spells. And then for your filler, I suggest, like I said, you don't take Mind Spike while leveling, which means your filler is just going to be Mind Flay, right? So if you have nothing else to press, you're just going to press Mind Flay. And then you're kind of building up to 50 Insanity. Now, in this suggested build, I suggest that you take Mind Flay Insanity. This is a very, very powerful spell. It's one of the bigger talents that we offer. It'll do a pretty good chunk of damage. The trick, though, is you can only cast it right after you've cast a Devouring Plague. So whenever you get to this point where you have your dots up, you're going to spend Insanity with Devouring Plague. And then you can see Mind Flay Insanity is now active, meaning the next Mind Flay you press is now empowered. It's a Mind Flay Insanity. It's a little bit quicker. Does a bit more damage. And for those Mind Flay Insanity casts, you want to full channel it, so try not to empty it, or try not to cancel it early. And that's really going to be the rotation. There's not a whole lot to it. From like a leveling perspective, I try to keep it pretty simple. And then as you add more targets, obviously the challenge, so to speak, comes in with keep your dots up on as many targets as possible. You know, use Shadow Crash to help you dot effectively. And the other big thing is kind of some of the things that do change your rotation up a little bit that I think you should know for this kind of leveling or opening a little bit if you're doing dungeons or whatnot. The first one we'll cover is Mind Spike versus Mind Flay. So if you would like to take Mind Spike, as I did mention before, it is kind of the thing you want to take in single target with that build. The tricky part here is juggling Mind Spike, Mind Flay Insanity can be somewhat complex. The guide goes over this in really great detail, so if you're really curious on how to optimize it, you can check there. The basics of this is, if you have Mind Spike talented, you probably also have Surge of Darkness talented, and then you probably also have Mind Melt talented, depending on the build. So, if you have a Surge of Darkness talented, and you have a Surge of Darkness proc, you're going to use that with priority when you're moving, right, as it's just an instant cast to move. If you don't have it active, then you use Mind Flay Insanity if it's available. If that's not available, then you can start filling with Mind Spike when you have Mind Melt talented. And if you don't have any of those, then you press Mind Flay. That's the simplest answer. I would suggest for a lot of people, if you're just leveling, if you're just doing dungeons, don't even worry about Mind Spike unless you really want to, unless something you want to try out. It does overly complicate the filler section of a rotation, which honestly isn't really the part that you want to be optimizing. And heck, even at level 70, not taking Mind Spike is like a 0.5% DPS loss. So if you're cool ignoring it, I would suggest ignoring it, at least for the kind of leveling and dungeon period. Once we start getting into raids, you want to really min-max your single target damage, that's when I would maybe start trying to mix it in, but that's my 2 cents. And then the other thing to think about is Mind Seer. So with this rework going into Dragonflight, you have 2 Insanity Spenders. Devouring Plague for single target, and Mind Seer for AoE. So long story short, Devouring Plague is the only Insanity Spender you should use on single target. Right? Spend your Insanity on Devouring Plague. And long story short with that, you want to use it such that you keep maximum uptime of the dot for our mastery that I mentioned before, but you don't want to overcap on Insanity. So that's kind of how you balance using Devouring Plague. On 2 targets, it changes a little bit. You're still going to use Devouring Plague as your primary spender. The change here is specifically with the talent called Mind Devour, which I've talked about before. If you have a Mind Devour proc up, then you can start spending that on Mind Seer starting at 2 targets. And the reason for that is, like I mentioned before, with the Mind Devour proc, makes your next Devouring Plague or Mind Seer free. But the Mind Seer that's free, you get 100 Insanity for free. And starting at 2 targets, that becomes better than Devouring Plague. It's a small gain at 2 targets. It gets bigger as you go up. But just know, Devouring Plague on 1 target and 2 targets, except Mind Devour, use that with Mind Seer on 2 targets. And then anything after that, so 3 targets and above, only spend Insanity on Mind Seer. And with that, you pretty much can just, whenever you get 50 or enough Insanity, get your 2 ticks out, you can pretty much cast it whenever. If you want it detailed, like, here's kind of when to think about using Mind Seer and all the different cases, that is also in the guide. I kind of went through like, oh, you're opening a pack, you can do this kind of thing, or this is kind of what you're looking for. So check that out if you want kind of more advanced usage. But hopefully this gets you started with the rotation, at least enough to leveling. If you want anything more in depth, I suggest reading the guide. And then, like I said, in a couple weeks, I'll kind of put out a more in-depth video with all the nitty-gritty stuff. But that's the high-level Shadow Priest rotation that you need to know. All right, now, while you're gearing up, obviously we want to make sure we have the right stats on our gear. So you pretty much get the choice with your gearing and kind of what you're choosing between. You have 4 secondary stats: Haste, Critical Strike, Mastery, or Versatility. As a Shadow Priest, Haste and Mastery are your 2 top stats that you want to be looking for. So anytime you get a gear, maybe it's the same item level or something like that, you want to prefer the one that has Haste or Mastery on it, ideally both. But we still really like item level. So specifically, the item level on a piece of gear determines how much intellect it'll have. And generally speaking, we favor item level over everything else. So while you're gearing, you're going to get upgrades. Even if they don't have haste or mastery on them, they're actually probably still better, just because we're getting that extra intellect on that piece. And our secondary stats aren't that crazy apart from each other, such that we would start dropping item levels to get optimal secondary stats. That's really not something you'd consider, except on rings and your neck piece, because they do not have main stat. So it's okay to drop a few item levels for that, but otherwise you'll kind of keep that going for those. And in general, like I said, haste is your top stat, then mastery, and then crit and verse are kind of tied for third place. The caveat with that is, unfortunately, not every single spell that we have is scaling with our mastery currently. As of recording this video, among all the other bugs that are happening, Idol Yogg-Saron's damage currently does not scale with mastery. The only reason I'm bringing this up, if you're ever taking a build that is using Idol of Yogg-Saron, that means mastery is a little bit worse than it would be otherwise. So if you are using Yogg-Saron, general priority, haste over mastery. If you are not using a Yogg-Saron for whatever you're doing, haste and mastery are actually really, really close together, and you could even argue mastery is even better in some cases. So generally speaking, if you follow that rule, you'll be in good shape, and that's your general stat priority. Okay, one of the last things I want to talk about is just general consumables. So all the pieces you can do to augment your character. So we'll cover those real quick here. I don't have any fancy graphics for this. I apologize. Just wanted to get this out as soon as possible. But just so you have just kind of accurate information for at least the start of Dragonflight, let's talk through what these look like. So first things first, let's cover food buff. So there is a Faded Fortune cookie. I don't exactly know how easy it's going to be to get this, but it's effectively a single buff food version of the feast. So whenever you can use this is what you want to use. It's literally the exact same benefit as a feast is, but on your personal character instead, and hopefully cheaper to make than a feast. Obviously, we'll see what happens, but yeah, Faded Fortune Cookie, that's what you want to use if you can. Now, obviously, if you're looking at this is going to look a little suspicious if you look up some of these, what these are, but effectively what this is showing you how close our secondary stats are. If you're not inside of a raid, honestly, use whatever food is like cheapest, to be honest, like get away with it, whatever you want. I would suggest using haste food just because haste generally will cover up more mistakes than the sim is showing. You can see a lot of these food buffs are pretty close together. I mean, we're talking 0.1% DPS, like it's pretty minor in the grand scheme of things. But I would generally look for the kind of haste or mastery food. They also have haste mastery combination food that you can use as well. It basically just splits the difference on the two stats. You can try that as well. But honestly, for leveling especially, like don't really worry about it. But once you want to optimize your food buff, that's what I would suggest. I don't have the feast on the sim yet, but obviously the feast is going to be equal to the Faded Fortune Cookie inside of raid. So there is a new augment rune called the Draconic Augment Rune. Feel free to use this if you want. As you can see, it's a decent chunk of damage, so something. Okay, so enchants. We have a bunch of brand new enchants. I'm only going to cover the throughput ones. I believe wrist, cloak, and feet all have non-throughput enchants. When I say non-throughput, they're like things like movement speed, leech, whatever else it is, like that kind of thing. So pick whatever you prefer on those. I would suggest avoidance is usually pretty good if you can get it. Otherwise, speed's good as well. For throughput enchants, Sovic Devotion is going to be the weapon enchant of choice. And as you can see here, it's doing pretty well. Now, this is a good time to point out, you can see all of these numbers, if you can read this carefully, have a rank next to them. So a lot of the profession stuff, you can now craft it at different ranks. Rank 1, 2, or 3 currently. Now, these all kind of change how expensive it is to craft, that kind of thing, and how much power you're getting out of it. But this could be a little hard depending on availability on actual release of how expensive some of this stuff is. So I wanted to kind of show you like the actual raw data here, just to show you how little some of this actually matters. So like I said, Selfic Devotion is going to be your best weapon enchant. And if I kind of highlight this here, you can see between ranks 1, 2, and 3, it's actually, it's a relatively small amount of damage. So in this case, it's 0.34% DPS difference between the rank 1 and rank 3. It's nothing to scoff at. Like, obviously that's an increase, but it's not ridiculous either. So don't feel bad. I would especially say as you're gearing up, you're getting pre-raid gear, like Mythic 0 gear. Rank 1 enchant would be my minimum, depending on how prices go. And in the Icy Veins guide, I list kind of the DPS differentials for all of these, but they're all pretty reasonable. So having to drop rank, certainly not a big deal early on in the expansion. Obviously, once you get a piece of gear that's like, okay, I'm going to keep this for, till the end of the tier, rank 3 makes sense. But until we get those pieces, don't feel bad about not using them. Okay, so weapon enchant, we're going to use Selfic Devotion. So leg, there's a tailoring spell thread item coming back in the game. Between Frozen and Temporal, as you can see here, they're basically the same. Really pick whichever one you can get cheaper, doesn't really matter. For ring enchants, they're all the way down here. Generally speaking, just use mastery or haste, depending on kind of where your stats are at. This is kind of where you do want to play around with secondary stat diminishing returns. So once you cross the threshold of 30% haste, or in mastery's case, 19% is what it will show, you're going to start to get less value per point of secondary stat. These are called diminishing return curves. What this means is they're somewhat punishing you from going too hard into a single stat. They want you to diversify your stats. So what this means is, if I go back here, you can see, because these guys are so close together. So if we just look at the rank 3 versions of this, 0.5%, even going down to crit is another 0.5 down. Like, they're close enough to where if your character starts getting close to those DR points, you're not going to want to use, necessarily haste or mastery. You might even try crit reverse, just because it's just not worth. So strongly suggest any kind of enchant or gem that's secondary stat related to same your character to see what's better. Can really change based on your gear that you currently have. For your chest enchant, you're going to go the Waking Stats enchant. There's only 2. This is really the only one you want to use, though. And that should cover it with your kind of throughput enchants. Moving on to any kind of alchemy related stuff. So 2 main things here. We have potions, and then you have phials. So phials are the new name for flasks. If you play the game in the past, this is your one flask that you use. It's called a phial now. So potion is really easy. You're going to use the elemental potion of ultimate power. This is your DPS potion, more or less. There are a couple like fun potions you can use as well, but this is the one that you're going to use 99% of the time. So stock up on these. Like I said, there are also ranks of these guys, about 2.2% DPS between each rank. So again, not huge, but it is something. There is like an even cheaper version of this called the Elemental Potion of Power. You might want to use these guys depending on if they're cheaper at the start of the expansion, but eventually you'll want to use the big guys. Okay, phials. There are a lot more phials to kind of talk about here. So, and there's kind of a priority list of the phial that you want to use based on the situation. Each one has somewhat of a caveat before you're using it that I want to go over. So, first one, in general, what I'm saying goes for multiples of sims, whether it's multi-target AoE or whatever. Charged Isolation is going to be kind of your preferred enchant if you can. You see it's hovering right here at 6%. The catch here is you only get the full benefit here if you stay more than 10 yards away from your allies. So if you can do that, this is the phial that you want to be using. If for whatever reason the fight has a stacking mechanic, or at all in Mythic Plus, basically, you basically don't want to use Charged Isolation, especially with the coming affix. But if there's a fight where, you can afford to be kind of 10 yards apart from your allies the majority of the time, would use Charged Isolation. So that's your kind of first option. Second option is the Phial of Static Empowerment. As you can see, it is a little bit worse, but it's by no means significant, so I wouldn't worry about that. But the trick here is, if you are moving a lot, you lose the benefit. So the benefit here is, you want to be standing still as much as possible. So if the fight doesn't have a whole lot of forced movement, again, not Mythic Plus, but if it's like in a raid environment or whatever, and you can afford to kind of plant your feet literally for a good period of time, it does have some baked in protection to where if you break it and then go back to standing still quickly, you'll keep the uptime of it. So like stutter step movement, that kind of thing is appropriate, but for any big movement fights, don't even try, honestly. And then your third option here, so the next one down, is Iced Phial of Corrupting Rage. As you can see, the gap is starting to get a little bit bigger with this guy, so again, not quite as good. Part of this is because I think this gives crit, and we don't really like crit. So, but with this guy, the trick is, if you're taking a lot of damage, you lose this. So if the fight has a lot of ticking damage, and it forces you to move a lot, and you have to be close to your allies, then you can't use any of these three, which that part kind of stinks, but them's the breaks. So if you're running into a fight and none of these apply, like you have to be moving a lot, you're going to be stacking frequently, and you're taking a lot of damage, that's when I would use the Phial of Tepid Versatility. It's a pretty basic thing. It is literally just giving you a bunch of verse. As you can see, at rank 3, 3.5%, it's almost half as good as Charged Isolation or Static Empowerment. So you can kind of like do a little bit of napkin math and say, like, if you have to move for like 25% of the fight, right, you can still use Static Empowerment. Or if you're only stacking for 25% of the fight, you can still use Charged Isolation. When you end up having to get to the scenarios where you're doing this for more than half the fight, that's when I would strongly consider just using Tepid Versatility. The other thing to keep in mind here, the Versatility Phial is giving you some amount of inbuilt defensive value as well. So on progression, it could even be that if the boss doesn't have a whole lot of DPS checks, I would actually suggest running this anyway, just to make it easier on the healers to survive mechanics, that kind of thing. You're still getting damage out of it. It's just you can afford to do whatever you want. You're not taking any negative effects. And that's kind of your Phial thing. So honestly, if you're a raider and you really care about this, I would strongly consider keeping all of these in your bags at a given time. As far as which ones you use in Mythic Plus, that one's going to be a much harder question to answer. Again, strongly consider the Versatility one, even though it's a little bit, it's definitely not as good. But yeah, that's kind of what it's up. Otherwise, you get to play around with Charged Isolation and Static Empowerment, which might be kind of annoying depending on what you want. But that should get you started with Consumables inside of Dragonflight. Hope that helps. All right, before I close out this video, I do want to just call it a couple things. First one, make sure you get your macros ready for Dragonflight. I know it's a little bit of a weird, silly thing, but it feels like a pretty common thing that people are asking for. I have all the common ones that everyone's asking inside of my macros page on Icy Veins. So if you want one that combines Angelic Feather and Powered Shield, I have a couple options for you here. If you want one like a Power Infusion macro with Twins of the Sun Priestess, I have a template that you can use for that. Other ones that I would suggest, so there's the Mind Flay Insanity no cancel macro. So basically what this means is if you're spamming your Mind Flay key and you have a Mind Flay Insanity active, it won't let you overwrite Mind Flay Insanity with a Mind Flay so that you finish out your ticks. Just a small point of improvement here. There's also stuff in here for talent choice macros. This will be updated to the new conditions soon, but if you have that kind of annoying bug, or depending on how you have your action bars set up with the new UI, where you swap out a choice node talent and then you have to like replace it on your bars every time, there's a macro that you can just put that in one kind of line and be done with it. There's a couple other things in here, like the @cursor Shadow Crash macro I'd suggest. But wanted to call this out. If you don't have these, I would just get these set up before launch, just so that you're all ready and good to go. And as always, this page has like other kind of add-on suggestions, or if you want my WeakAura package, like all that stuff is linked here as well. Make sure to check that out if you're looking for something that I use or that I like. So that is kind of macro-y stuff. All right, that is all I got for this video. Like I said, I try to do really high-level stuff, just quick and easy versions of things. If you want any of the in-depth answers, highly suggest you check out and read the Icy Veins guide that's here. It's going to have just about everything you're going to need for Shadow Priest that you can check out here. If you have any questions about anything or you want to talk about some of the options, would definitely suggest hopping in the Warcraft Priest Discord, where myself, the other admins, mods, etc., and regulars will help kind of talk about things. I definitely don't mean to say that I cover everything, but hopefully this is a good starting point for a lot of you if you're trying out Shadow for the first time, or if you're a returning player. Welcome back to the spec. It's by no means perfect. It still has a lot of bugs to work through, but I feel confident as a community we'll figure out a way to make it fun and reasonably playable. So thank you so much for watching, and please leave a comment down below if there's something specific that you want me to cover as we get into Dragonflight. If there's like a specific thing you want me to cover in the upcoming video version of the guides, or if you have questions, I'll do my best to answer them as best as possible, especially the first couple weeks of the expansion. So you can always ask things there or in Discord or whatever else. But thank you so much for watching. Big thanks to everyone supporting me, whether it's on Patreon, the Twitch subs, all the YouTube members that are coming out. Really appreciate all the support, guys. It means a whole lot to me, and hope you enjoyed it. We'll catch you in the next one. Bye.